There is a moment during deep transformation that almost nobody recognizes while it is happening, not because it is rare, but because it looks nothing like the change people imagine. It doesn't arrive with excitement, it doesn't feel like motivation, and it certainly doesn't look like progress. Instead, something far stranger begins to happen. The world around you starts feeling slightly unreal. Conversations sound distant. Familiar places feel temporary. Even your own thoughts begin to feel like echoes from a version of you that no longer fully exists. Most people misunderstand this moment. They think they are confused, burned out, losing direction. But from the perspective of consciousness and quantum reality, something very different is happening. You are not breaking down, you are detaching from the identity that once held your reality together before a new one fully forms. And in that strange space between who you were and who you are becoming, reality itself begins to reorganize. Part 1. The Age Before the Gods. In the beginning, there was no throne of Olympus, no lightning, no kings of heaven. There was only a mother, and her imprisoned children. Gaia, the earth, had brought forth the Titans, beings of immense strength, vast as mountains, ancient as time itself. They should have ruled beside their father, Uranus, the sky, but Uranus feared them. He saw their power. He saw what they might become. And like many rulers after him, he chose control over love. One by one, he forced his children deep into the womb of the earth, burying them alive in darkness. The mountains groaned. The world trembled. Gaia suffered, not as a goddess, but as a mother, and suffering eventually becomes rage. So she devised the first act of rebellion in cosmic history. From the bones of the earth, Gaia forged a weapon, a great, curved sickle. Not for war, for justice. She called upon her children. Most were too afraid to answer, but one stepped forward. Cronus, youngest of the Titans. Cunning, patient, ruthless. He did not challenge his father openly. He waited. He hid. He watched the heavens until the moment Uranus descended to embrace Gaia once more, and then Cronus struck. With one swing of the sickle, he severed the rule of the sky. Power changed hands not with ceremony, but with blood falling into the sea. The age of Uranus ended. The age of the Titans began. Cronus freed his brothers and sisters from their prison. He was hailed as a liberator, a new king, a new hope. But power has a way of changing those who seize it. Cronus took the throne. He married his sister, Rhea, and together they began to create a new generation of gods. Yet a prophecy followed him like a shadow. Just as he had overthrown his father, one of his own children would overthrow him. Cronus remembered the fear of Uranus, and slowly, he became it. Each time Rhea gave birth, Cronus took the child in his hands and swallowed it whole. No burial, no mercy, no future. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, all consumed, all erased. Rhea watched her children vanish into the darkness of their father's stomach. And the world, once again, stood on the edge of despair. But this time, a mother would not remain silent, because the next child she carried would not be sacrificed. He would be hidden, and his name would be Zeus. Part 2. When reality starts feeling flexible. As this internal shift continues, another strange change begins to appear. It is not just your thoughts that feel different. Your perception of reality begins changing as well. Situations that once felt emotionally heavy start losing their intensity. Conversations that once felt important begin feeling temporary. Even goals that used to define your life may suddenly feel less significant. Nothing dramatic has changed on the outside. Your environment may look exactly the same. The same people, the same routines, the same surroundings, but internally, the lens through which you interpret reality is beginning to transform. The brain relies on identity to organize perception. Identity acts like a filter, constantly deciding what information is important, what should be ignored, and how every experience should be interpreted. For years, that filter has been shaped by past experiences, memories, emotional reactions, repeated patterns of thinking. These patterns create what neuroscience calls predictive processing. Your brain is always predicting what will happen next based on what has already happened before. But when identity begins dissolving, those predictions start losing their certainty. The emotional charge attached to old experiences weakens, and without that emotional charge, The brain stops reacting automatically. That is why many people describe this phase as feeling strangely neutral. It is not happiness. It is not sadness. It is a quiet space in between. At first, that neutrality can feel confusing, because most people are used to living inside constant emotional stimulation, stress, urgency, excitement, worry. When those signals suddenly become quieter, the mind interprets the silence as something being wrong. But from a neurological perspective, something very important is happening. The nervous system is moving out of survival mode. When the brain operates under constant stress, it stays locked in high beta activity. This state keeps the mind scanning the environment for threats, predicting problems, and reacting quickly to maintain control. But when the nervous system begins regulating itself, brain activity often shifts towards slower frequencies like alpha and theta. These are the states associated with creativity, intuition, and deeper perception. Instead of constantly reacting to life, the brain becomes receptive to it. And when perception becomes receptive rather than reactive, something interesting begins to happen. Reality itself starts feeling slightly flexible. You may notice small coincidences appearing more often. Conversations may carry meanings deeper than the words being spoken. Certain moments in time feel strangely expanded, while entire days seem to pass faster than expected. It may feel as if life is quietly responding to something inside you. These experiences are not random. They happen because the old predictive patterns in the brain are weakening. Your perception is no longer locked into the same identity loops that once defined your reality. In simple terms, the observer is changing, and when the observer changes, the way reality is experienced begins changing as well. But this stage is also delicate, because the moment reality starts feeling unfamiliar, the mind often tries to regain control. It begins analyzing everything, questioning every feeling, searching for explanations. The brain evolved to prefer certainty. Uncertainty feels uncomfortable, even when it is the beginning of growth. So the mind tries to rebuild the old sense of control, but excessive analysis creates tension inside the nervous system, and tension pulls perception back toward the same familiar patterns that once stabilized the old identity. This is why many transformations quietly reverse at this stage. People return to familiar emotional reactions. They recreate old habits. They reattach themselves to the same identity that once shaped their life, and without realizing it, the previous version of reality stabilizes again. But when someone understands what is happening, they respond very differently. Instead of resisting the unfamiliar feeling, they allow it. Instead of forcing clarity, they remain present with the uncertainty, because that uncertainty is not confusion, it is openness. It is the moment where the mind stops forcing reality into old patterns, and when that happens, something powerful begins forming beneath the surface. The nervous system becomes calmer, perception becomes wider, the brain stops reacting automatically and begins observing more clearly. What once felt strange slowly starts feeling natural. The quiet inside the mind becomes comfortable, and reality begins responding to the new observer that is quietly taking shape. The old identity is no longer dominating perception, and the new one is beginning to emerge. Part 3. When the world starts responding. As the old identity weakens and the nervous system becomes quieter, another subtle shift begins to appear. Life starts behaving differently, not in dramatic miracles, not in sudden explosions of success, but in small patterns that feel almost impossible to ignore. You may start noticing coincidences appearing more frequently, the right conversation at the right time, information arriving exactly when you need it, unexpected opportunities crossing your path without the effort you once had to apply. At first, these moments seem random, but as they continue appearing, a strange feeling begins to form. It starts to feel as if life is quietly aligning itself around you. This is the stage where perception and reality begin interacting in a new way. For most of your life, your brain has been filtering reality through survival patterns, fear, control, expectation, prediction. These patterns narrow perception. The mind only notices what confirms the identity it already believes in. But when the old identity dissolves, that filter loosens. The brain becomes more sensitive to patterns it previously ignored. In neuroscience, this is linked to increased communication between different regions of the brain. The logical mind becomes less dominant. The intuitive systems of the brain become more active. At the same time, something else begins stabilizing inside the nervous system: coherence. When emotional chaos decreases, the brain and heart begin communicating more efficiently instead of scattered signals. The body begins operating in a more synchronized state, and when that coherence forms, perception expands. You begin noticing connections between events that once looked unrelated. A conversation leads to an opportunity, an idea leads to a solution. A small decision unexpectedly opens a new direction in life. From the outside, it might look like luck, but from the inside, it feels different. It feels like the world is responding to who you are becoming. Because identity determines attention, and attention determines what possibilities become visible. When your internal state shifts, your attention reorganizes itself around different information. Experiences that once felt invisible suddenly stand out. Opportunities that once passed unnoticed begin appearing clearly. And as these patterns continue, something interesting happens to your relationship with control. You stop trying to force everything. Plans still exist, goals still matter, but the urgency behind them begins dissolving. Instead of chasing outcomes, you begin moving with a quiet sense of alignment. Decisions start feeling simpler. Instead of endless analysis, there is a calm inner signal pointing toward certain directions. This is often what people describe as intuition, but intuition is not mysterious. It is what the nervous system does when it is no longer overwhelmed by noise. When emotional interference decreases, the brain processes information more clearly. It detects subtle signals faster. It connects patterns more efficiently, and because of that clarity, certain paths begin feeling naturally right. At this stage, life often starts unfolding with less resistance. Situations that once felt complicated resolve more easily. People who do not resonate with the new identity begin drifting away naturally, and new connections begin forming without effort. Nothing is being forced. It is simply alignment. The internal observer has changed, and because the observer has changed, reality begins reorganizing around that new perspective. Yet this phase still requires patience. Because the external world takes time to reflect internal shifts, identity stabilizes first, reality follows second. If you interrupt the process with fear, doubt, or the need to control every detail, the nervous system tightens again. The old patterns try to return, but when you allow the new internal coherence to remain stable, something powerful continues building beneath the surface. The new identity becomes stronger, the observer becomes clearer, and the structure of your reality slowly begins adjusting to match the person you are becoming. This is the stage where transformation stops being an idea and begins turning into a lived experience. Part 4. When the new identity becomes your reality. At some point during this transition, something important happens. The strange feeling that once made reality seem distant begins to disappear. The uncertainty fades, and in its place, a quiet sense of stability begins to form. The mind is no longer oscillating between the old identity and the new one. Instead, it begins settling into a different internal reference point. Your thoughts feel clearer, your reactions feel calmer, and the way you interpret life begins forming a new, consistent pattern. This is the moment when transformation stops being temporary. The new identity begins stabilizing. From the perspective of neuroscience, this is when new neural pathways become stronger than the old ones. The reactions that once defined your personality stop firing automatically. The emotional loops that once pulled you back into the past lose their influence. And gradually, the brain begins operating from a different internal structure. You are no longer trying to change. You have changed. From the perspective of consciousness, this moment is even more significant because reality does not simply respond to what you want. It responds to who you consistently are. For most of your life, the observer inside you was shaped by the past. Old experiences defined your expectations. Old emotions defined your reactions. And those reactions kept collapsing the same probabilities again and again. The same patterns, the same results, the same version of reality repeating itself. But once identity stabilizes in a new state, something remarkable begins happening. The observer changes, and when the observer changes, the field of possibilities reorganizes around that new perspective. This is why timeline shifts rarely feel like sudden miracles. They feel like a gradual alignment. Opportunities appear that match the new identity. Situations that once felt blocked begin moving again. Some relationships naturally fade because they no longer resonate with who you have become. Others deepen because they align with your new direction. Life begins mirroring the internal transformation that has already taken place. And when you look back, you may realize something surprising. The moment when everything started feeling strange. The moment when your thoughts felt distant. The moment when your identity felt like it was dissolving. That was not confusion. That was the doorway. It was the moment when the old version of you stopped holding reality in place, and the new observer began forming. At first, the shift was subtle, quiet, almost invisible, but over time, that quiet change became a new foundation. The version of life you once hoped for does not suddenly arrive like a miracle. It emerges gradually as your identity stabilizes, because reality was never separate from the observer. It was always responding to it. And when the observer becomes coherent, the world begins organizing itself around that coherence. Decisions become clearer. Opportunities begin appearing at the right moment. Situations that once required force now move with surprising ease. You begin acting differently, speaking differently, and thinking differently without even trying. The person you were trying to become slowly becomes the person you are. And with that shift, reality responds, not because you forced it, but because you became the version of yourself that naturally belongs in that reality. This is the deeper truth about transformation. It is not about chasing results. It is about becoming the observer who can hold those results consistently. Once that observer stabilizes, life begins aligning on its own. And this is why the strange phase in the beginning was so important. The quiet, the uncertainty, the feeling that reality was slightly unreal. That was the transition between two identities, one dissolving, the other forming. Most people turn back during that phase because the unfamiliar feeling makes them think something is wrong. But those who stay present through the silence discover something powerful. The silence was not emptiness, it was preparation. It was the moment where the old personality stopped reinforcing the past long enough for the future to reorganize itself. And when the process completes, something remarkable becomes clear. The reality you were waiting for did not suddenly arrive. It slowly formed around the identity you became. Because transformation was never about forcing the world to change. It was about allowing the observer within you to evolve. And once the observer becomes stable enough, the timeline shifts naturally, not through effort, not through struggle, but through alignment. And if your life has been feeling quiet lately, if your identity feels like it is dissolving and reforming at the same time, if reality feels slightly unfamiliar but strangely calm, then you may be standing in the exact place where real transformation begins. The space between who you were and who you are about to become. And that space is not confusion. It is the doorway to a different life.